Welcome back to the second hour of our program. Thom Hartmann here with you. The tricky 2009 politics of finance. Up at the top of Kevin Phillips' website, bad-money.com. Of course, the title of his book that is now out in paperback, updated with a new preface and afterword. A New York Times bestseller, Reckless Finance, the subtitle, Reckless Finance, Failed Politics, and the Global Crisis of American Capitalism. Also the author of American Dynasty, and which is Aristocracy, Fortune, and the Politics of Deceit in the House of Bush, American Theocracy, The Peril and Politics of Radical Religion, Oil, and Borrowed Money in the 21st Century, all the way back to the coming Republican majority. Kevin Phillips, welcome to the show.
Nice to be with you.
Nice to have you back here with us. First of all, before we get any farther into this, give us just a snapshot of where you think that this economy is at.
Well, it's hard to give you a snapshot. I'll try to give you a very brief. I know what you're looking for. A snapshot won't quite do it. Essentially, what we've got here is the consummation, the pretty negative consummation of what amounts to a 25-year pattern in the American economy of slowly elevating finance by just relentlessly, periodically bailing it out and pumping up the money supply. And as this has happened, I'll give one set of statistics. In 1987, when Alan Greenspan became Fed chairman, total credit market debt in the United States, that's all marketable, traded debt, was about $11 trillion. By the time he left in 2006, it was about $45 trillion. Just a mammoth expansion. And the rise in the size of the financial sector of the economy, which is finance, insurance, and real estate, and they are just totally intermingled like four-color linguine. I mean, there's no separating them at all. And they rose from being about 10%, 12% of U.S. GDP back in the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, to almost 21% in 2004. And what happened, again, to try to use another quick analogy, is that you had Jack climb this incredible beanstalk, but by the time he got all the way up, he turned into Frankenstein. Yeah. And we've got this collection of financial institutions that were basically harmless, even helpful 20 or 25 years ago, that got to the point where they couldn't metastasize, to use the sort of cancerous analogy, any longer, and in 2007 it started imploding. So what we've got here is this swollen, bloated financial sector of the economy, which has been backstopped and supported by federal regulators, politicians, both parties. It is now coming unglued. And this is why people hear figures in the trillions and the hundreds of billions, because this swollen element of the economy that went up to 21% of GDP has begun imploding. And the politicians and regulators will never tell you the scope of this. And we haven't seen the outcome of the deleveraging and the implosion. I'm not saying it's only beginning, but I'm saying it's not finished.
Right. And in your book, you also document how at the same time that the financial industry has exploded, particularly since 85, if I'm looking at the graph on page 32, and the profit graph on page 31 is pretty startling. At the same time that the financial industry has exploded in both revenues and profits, not to mention CEO and senior executive pay, manufacturing in the United States has fallen off a cliff.
Right.
So it seems to me that what we're looking at is libertarianism on steroids. We're looking at the elimination of Alexander Hamilton's policy on manufacturers he put into place in 1791 that to some extent Jimmy Carter began taking apart. Ronald Reagan got a little more aggressive, but Bill Clinton was the guy who really kicked the doors wide open on that, the so-called free trade. Thus, we no longer make things in the United States, make things of value. So instead what we're making is money, and there's an absolute limit to how much money you can make and have it have any value. Does that make any sense?
Yes. My one caveat here would be is that libertarians who were true to their own belief system would never have done the other half of the game, which is the relentless bailouts, the socialization of risk.
Right.
What happened then? The people who did this were essentially people in both parties and to some extent of all different ideologies, although I basically would take the left out of the package, who wanted to go along with good times and with the whole idea of ATMs and mutual funds and let everything happen and have a tech bubble and everything. And it's sort of the establishment centrist, or as culpable as anybody else, right. The establishment, organization, corporate-type conservatives, but then an awful lot of rank-and-file liberals. And Bill Clinton, you can't say he's a conservative, really, but he was right in there.
I would say he was more conservative. I would say he was more conservative than Dwight Eisenhower, who was quite happy with the 91% top marginal income tax rate and a big advocate of Social Security.
Well, see, this brings me into I'm not a Republican anymore, but I was for most of my life. And Eisenhower, yes, and I remember Richard Nixon telling me that they didn't dare touch that 91% rate.
That's right.
And they didn't during the Eisenhower years.
No, and it kept us stable. We have this great stability. Now you've got CEOs who are making $100 million a year as their base salary, and 240 working days out of the year. Somebody's making $400,000 a day for what? It's crazy. I was impressed that you're quoting Joseph, is it Schumpeter?
Yeah.
Is how it's pronounced, and Hyman Minsky, the Austrian school, and then in the 70s Hyman Minsky. The whole idea of debt. Ravi Batra on this program, the professor of economics at Southern Methodist University and New York Times bestselling author, suggested that literally from the founding of this country until the early 80s, that supply and demand, supply represented by productivity, demand represented by wages, were tracking each other fairly consistently all during that period in time. And in the 80s, they began to diverge, and demand, wages, flattened out, and supply continued to increase. Productivity continued to increase. A lot of that increase was the result of our offshoring much of our manufacturing, but nonetheless, supply increased productivity. And so what filled in the void as those two lines separated, what filled in that growing triangle was debt. And this is something that you go into, Kevin Phillips, in considerable detail in your book, Bad Money, is how debt has brought us to where we are. How did we get here with this whole?
Debt became an industry in the United States. It's kind of incredible. It's not just something sold by bond dealers. It's become part of the fabric of American society. During the 70s and 80s, you began to see consumer debt rising steadily as the American consumer was pushed into bearing more and more of the burden of the economy. And as this happened, of course, debt rose because it was funding the consumer spending patterns. So you get a rise in the role of household debt, credit card debt, mortgage debt, and so forth. At the same time, with the banks and the insurance companies and the corporations and the government all borrowing on their various big scales, and private borrowing was much bigger than public, you get the growth of a Goliath debt industry in terms of its role in the financial markets and in the investment firms. And the upshot is they've just created this cavalcade of debt which now hangs over the economy, and people like Bernanke, who I have just no use for this man at all, he thinks you can keep this from imploding by adding more of liquidity and debt and money supply expansion that was central to the problem in the first place.
Right. It's like they're trying to reflate the bubble in the hopes that... Now, my hope is that they're trying to reflate the bubble so that they can get by themselves a year or two and change our fundamental trade policies and manufacturing and go back to a national industrial policy and rebuild the economy of this country, although I fear that that's not what's actually going on.
I don't think that's what's going on. I think the administration will not do too much for organized labor, is moving away from its previous seeming commitments on trade issues, and in other words, behaving like a perfect bipartisan establishmentarian centrist government.
They're back to Clinton again, who
back
was,
to Clinton
as
and
I
away
said,
from the ordinary American.
Right, and who, as I said, was more conservative in this regard, and I use that word not in its traditional sense, than Eisenhower, or more destructive with regard to trade policy. Can you stick around for one more segment?
Sure.
Kevin Phillips is with us. His book, out in paperback now, New York Times bestseller. It's brilliant. Bad Money, the website bad-money.com. We'll be right back here on the Thom Hartmann Program.